From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Tuesday, August 4th, 2015. Activists are raising the stakes against drilling for oil in the Arctic. We'll speak with Daphne Wysham about last week's historic protest in Portland, Oregon. And Dr. Johanna Fernandez joins us to discuss the latest book by political prisoner Mumia Abu Jamal. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Thousands of Mexican activists and journalists have been protesting the brutal murders of a well-known journalist named Ruben Espinosa and 4 women. Espinosa, who had faced threats over his work in the state of Veracruz, had fled to Mexico City fearing for his life. He was seemingly tracked down and killed. The Mexican government has not yet identified formally the 4 other women who were killed alongside him, but media have identified Nadia Vera, an activist, and Yesenia Quiroz Alfaro, a student. The 2 other women included another activist and a domestic worker. The women appear to have been sexually assaulted before being killed. All 5 victims showed signs of struggle. Their bodies were bound and appear to have been tortured before they were killed. The Mexican government is saying it is investigating the murders. Reports indicate that this year has been a particularly bloody year for Mexican journalists. Well, Bob, there seems to be one crisis after another in Mexico. Do you think that this latest horrific incident is also going to galvanize people like we've seen in the past 6 months or so in Mexico?
Well, that's the only hope. Everyone understands that police officials, the government, the military is not trustworthy in investigating these things, so it will take public pressure. As someone living in the United States, as a U.S. citizen, I know that the most important thing we can do in the United States is to try to argue for a sensible drug policy, because everyone understands that the force behind this violence against journalism is the drug war. And as long as the United States pursues its insane drug policies, the market in the United States will be there, the cartels will be working, and journalists will be at risk. It's been a particularly bloody decade for journalists, and I think this even more than ever makes the case for drug reform in the United States.
Here in the United States, a Republican presidential candidate forum in New Hampshire yesterday drew on stage 14 people, among them Jeb Bush, Rick Perry, Chris Christie, and the sole woman Carly Fiorina. Among the issues discussed was the economy, immigration, and the federal budget. FactCheck.org released a lengthy list of questionable statements made by the candidates. And the event was notable for its awkwardness. According to the New York Times, quote, the Republicans gawked at each rival as each rival took his or her turn on stage, looking at times as if they were being forced to sit through a tedious school assembly. Donald Trump was glaring in his absence at the forum. Mr. Trump apparently felt that the event was not worth his while. In a CBS News poll released just this morning, Trump leads the Republican field of candidates. He commands 24% popularity, with his closest rival being Jeb Bush at a mere 13%. Well, Bob, why is Trump leading the field? I mean, is it just that he's shining with promise, or that his many rivals simply do not inspire much confidence among Republican voters?
Well, as you've been speaking, I've been suppressing laughter because, of course, the Republican presidential race is kind of a sick joke. But we should take it seriously, of course, for a couple of things. First of all, I think what's important about this race is not just what it says about the Republicans, but what it says about our politics in general. The fact that money dominates the entertainment value of politicians like Donald Trump. There's something, deeply wrong with the American electoral system. And I think this is just a kind of a farce that displays that even more directly. It's also a reminder, when we look past the circus, that the Republican Party is been pushed to the right systematically over the last 30 or 40 years, to the point where it's really not a normal electoral party in the way that you think of that in most of the industrial world. It's kind of a renegade operation. And that the fact that there are so many fringe candidates, so many really untenable candidates, just demonstrates that the Republicans are in a very strange place. And that's dangerous because, of course, even though we might think of them as off the charts loony, a good chunk of the American public supports them.
And finally, in a victory for animal rights activists, a federal judge just ruled the so-called Ag-Gag law unconstitutional in Idaho, saying that, quotes, food and worker safety are matters of public concern. Judge B. Lynn Windmill ruled against a law that was passed in the wake of an undercover video showing animal cruelty at Betancourt Dairies, which is Idaho's largest dairy farm. Industry groups fought back, saying that the filming was intended to hurt their business, but state legislators then craft a bill in their support, and Idaho Governor C.L. Butch Otter signed it. The judge who ruled against the law yesterday said that anti-trespassing laws already protect farms. The group Mercy for Animals released a statement saying this is a huge victory not only for the Constitution, but animals and consumers. Bob, how important is this ruling, even if you're not an animal rights activist?
It's very crucial for journalism and for the larger questions of our food system. Remember, this is not just about cruelty to animals, it's about human health, since factory farming is extremely dangerous to our own health. And it's also about the larger question of whether we can design a sustainable food system. So this is important. And of course, this is not the only state that had an Ag-Gag law. Last time I counted, I think there are 5 others. So we hope that this case proceeds and the laws around the country are struck down. There are also food libel laws that have been pushed to try and suppress critique of the food system. One other thing that's worth noting is the original Ag-Gag law came from a model that was written by ALEC, right? That very famous right-wing group that's always looking for ways to undermine public safety, consumer sovereignty, and push the rights of corporations. So this is something we need to keep an eye on.
Bob Jensen, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Environmental activists in Portland, Oregon ended their protest on Friday against a Shell icebreaker ship called the Fennica. The ship was held up at a port when it arrived on July 25th for repairs to its hull. A number of activists from local groups surrounded the ship in kayaks, after which Greenpeace members joined in, dangling from ropes off of the St. John Bridge. Eventually, port authorities arrested some of the activists. The Fennica is headed to the Arctic to break up ice in the Chukchi Sea that many worry will destroy a fragile natural environment and also fuel climate change. The groups involved were from the Portland Area Climate Action Coalition, including 350 PDX, Portland Rising Tide, and the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network, and they were supported by Greenpeace. Shell spokesperson Megan Baldino responded to the protest saying, quote, "We respect the rights of individuals and groups to express their opinion. All we ask is that they do so within the confines of the law and maintain safety as their first priority. Safety is paramount." Joining me now to talk about what happened last week and what may follow next is Daphne Wysham. She is the director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for Sustainable Economy. Welcome to Uprising, Daphne.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, can you give us a timeline of what happened on July 24th, 25th-ish? Local activists got wind that this ship, the Fennica, which is supposed to essentially break the ice in the Arctic, that this ship was coming through to the port for repairs, and so you organized very quickly to block it?
Yeah, well, the backstory on all of this is that we have been mobilizing here in the Portland area since last fall. The largest pipeline company in the Canadian tar sands, they are called Pembina Pipeline Corporation, wanted to build a propane terminal in downtown Portland. And that was one of the reasons why the Climate Action Coalition formed. We were outraged that a tar sands company wanted to turn the greenest city in America into an export origin for their propane. So we took on the mayor, who initially embraced this proposal. It was the single largest business proposal in Portland history, and we got him to reverse it. And after that, we were fairly well organized in our direct action, our nonviolent civil disobedience. We found that that was what worked the best in getting the attention of both the mayor and the media. And so when the Fennica came to town, we mobilized all those people who had already had plenty of practice in working together. And we decided we were inspired by the so-called kayaktivists up in Seattle who had taken on the Polar Explorer in Seattle with their kayaks. And so we decided to do the same thing on the Willamette River. And we mobilized dozens, perhaps hundreds of kayakers out on the river. And then at 3 a.m, much to our surprise, the Greenpeace climbers descended from the St. John's Bridge and joined us by air. So we had effectively both a water and an air blockade of the Fennica. And when it tried to head out to sea, it could not do so.
Wow. So were they surprised? Were they caught off guard? Could you tell what the reaction was of people on the ship?
Absolutely. I think they were caught off guard just as we were. We had no idea that Greenpeace was going to stage this action. And, we were exhausted because we had been working around the clock. So it gave some of our kayaktivists a break. They could go home, get some sleep, come back in a few hours. And we put the word out that we needed a constant wave of kayakers out on the water to hold the water blockade in place. And, I went up to the Fennica with a camera crew prior to all of this. And the only security they had was what we believed to be Shell's private security, standing guard. The Fennica was behind a giant curtain where it was getting repaired for a huge gash in its hull, which it had gotten that gash because it was taking a shortcut up in the Arctic, and it just is an indication of one of the reasons why we were so concerned about this drilling in the Arctic. These kinds of accidents happen all the time, and should that have been an oil tanker, we could have seen a major spill that could never be cleaned up. I mean, there is a 75% chance. According to the Department of Interior, there's a 75% chance of a spill once drilling commences in the Arctic. So that's concern number one. But the greater concern for all of us is that we know climate change is underway and that we have to leave untapped reserves, such as those reserves in the Arctic, off limits if we are going to avoid dangerous and possibly irreversible climate change. So the Arctic must stay sacrosanct. We cannot drill there. We need to actually ramp down existing proven reserves and leave about 80% of proven reserves in the ground.
Now, Daphne, the Shell drilling operations are basically going to the Arctic because they've been permitted to, right? I mean, isn't the responsibility to be shared with the Obama administration and our members of Congress in Washington, D.C., who also support these sorts of things? The Obama administration didn't have to give permits to Shell.
Absolutely. And we still have time to get Obama to rescind that permit. We have a few days until the Fennica arrives in the Arctic. I can't remember exactly how many days it's expected to take. But if people can register their strong concern, write a letter to President Obama calling on him to rescind that permit to drill, he does have that power. In Oregon, we do have Senator Merkley, who has submitted a bill to the Senate calling on no drilling in the Arctic, and we're urging all senators to join him in supporting that bill.
Now, and explain exactly how this works. The Fennica is an icebreaker ship because the Arctic is covered with ice much of the year, but also because some of it is now melting and can be potentially more easily broken up. In order for Shell to have its drilling operations, it first needs to have a ship like the Fennica go in and lay the groundwork for the operations.
Yeah, so Shell has at least, what I hear is they have two icebreakers. This is the reason the Fennica is critical is because it has what they call a capping stack on board the ship. And the capping stack is a critical piece of equipment that's required by law. One of the conditions that the Obama administration put on drilling is that they had to have a capping stack. So should there be a spill comparable to the one that we saw in the Gulf of Mexico, where BP couldn't contain the spill for weeks and months, they would have in place a piece of equipment that theoretically is supposed to cap that spill. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that we saw how difficult it was to cap the spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which is essentially in a tropical or a much warmer region than the Arctic. Imagine a spill taking place in the dead of winter with a Coast Guard station 1,000 miles away. That's the nearest form of any sort of civilization, 1,000 miles away. So we have to assume that if a spill were to take place anytime other than perhaps in that narrow window in the summer when they could actually maneuver around, that it would spill out of control. So, yeah.
That's incredible. So basically, there's a situation where we know there will be inevitable spills, and those spills are likely to not be cleaned up. What is the short-term impact? We know, of course, the long-term impact of extracting oil and then burning it is worse climate change. But the short-term impact of spills, what does that look like?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we are learning as a result of the world's largest spill, the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, is that the dispersant that they used, Corexit, was at least as bad for both for marine life and for humans as the spill itself. There's an entire dead zone at the bottom of the ocean where the oil and the dispersant has settled. People have been complaining of all kinds of health problems in the Gulf Coast, those who were exposed to the Corexit. And of course, the bottom line is that Corexit, all it does is it makes the oil disappear, and it helps it sort of break it down into smaller particles, but that doesn't mean the oil isn't still in the marine ecosystem. So really, there is no such thing as a cleanup of an oil spill. You can get some sort of cosmetic cleanup, perhaps, but I doubt you could even get that in the Arctic.
What about impact to indigenous communities in the area as well?
That's a very important point. There are quite a few native and indigenous communities up in the Arctic region that have relied on the marine ecosystem for their survival for generations. And of course, they're very concerned about the chance of a spill and how that would affect their right to maintain their traditional way of life.
Now, what finally happened to the action? We talked about how your kayaktivists in the Portland region had been mobilized. To their surprise, got support from the bridge by Greenpeace members. And on Friday, that whole protest was shut down. How did it pan out? What happened? Were people arrested?
It was a very dramatic last few minutes. After 40 hours of holding the blockade, the police did cut the ropes that were connecting the climbers to each other on the bridge. Had they not done so, if the Fennica proceeded, it would have pulled all of the 13 climbers towards each other, and that would have been very hazardous. So they decided to cut the ropes and also extract several of the climbers. And then the Fennica proceeded inching along, trying to avoid kayaktivists. There were Coast Guard and police boats in the water trying to fend them off. Some of them used quite aggressive strategies to take on the kayaktivists, despite the fact that they said safety was their #1 priority. We have footage of a Coast Guard boat actually ramming into a kayaktivist who was in turn thrown into the water.
Wow.
We've also heard that several people that were trained in water safety that tried to rescue 2 kayaktivists that were thrown into the water were actually detained so that they could not go and rescue those folks. They were from the Backbone campaign, which I should say provided very critical support for us. They came down from Seattle and helped us with a lot of the training because they had gone through this before. So we were, there were a group of us that were standing on the dock. The dock was sort of going up and down with all the waves, and people were sobbing. I mean, they were literally, they knew those of us who knew what was at stake were just heartbroken that our mayor and our city did not allow this protest to continue, but instead ensured that Shell's right to drill, so-called right to drill, was protected more strongly than our right to protest.
Well, Daphne, is that a result of the fact that the city essentially gets money from these sorts of operations where ships come in and get repairs, major repairs? It's probably a source of revenue?
Well, of course, that's one position that you could take, but all you have to do is look a little bit further north to Seattle to see what the mayor and other city councilors did, and they came out in support of the protesters and actually registered their strong opposition to Arctic drilling. So, there are very different ways in which public officials can handle this, and we were disappointed in our mayor.
And so then is part of your activism also going to be aimed at city officials like the mayor for future such things?
Yes, and by the way, the mayor has been invited he went to Washington to meet with President Obama over the weekend. He was there yesterday when President Obama unveiled his Clean Power Plan, so-called Clean Power Plan. And we urged him, we said there are several ways in which we would you can't really redeem yourself completely for what he did, but we urged him to, first of all, send our message, which is that all of us who risked our lives and limbs out on the water and in the air absolutely want to send a very clear message to President Obama that an all of the above energy strategy, especially one that includes drilling in the Arctic, cannot result in climate stability. And secondly, that we needed to get all the charges dropped against all of the protesters, and there are still some charges outstanding.
Daphne, I'm glad you brought up President Obama's plan, the Clean Power Plan, which is really important in this context. The president is calling it the biggest, most important step we have ever taken in tackling climate change. Isn't one of the things the president could do to tackle climate change to simply rescind the permit of Shell oil in the Arctic?
That's one of many things that he could be doing. You can't simultaneously have an all of the above energy strategies, he likes to call it, and take bold action on climate. We absolutely cannot be opening up unproven reserves. As I said before, we need to leave 80% of proven reserves in the ground. Coal in particular must stay in the ground. Tar sands must stay in the ground. Gas, with natural gas, of course, we've got this fracking boom going on across the United States, which has resulted in the U.S. being the #1 producer of oil. And soon, I don't know if we're the #1 producer of gas, but we're getting there. So those two things are contributing to the release of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas and much more serious in terms of its climate impact. So even though Obama has pushed back a little bit on the fracking targets in this Clean Power Plan, they still are a very critical piece of the Clean Power Plan. And our concern is that that will result in potentially an increase in emissions, especially if there are fugitive methane emissions.
And his power plan seems to be focused on power plants, the place where the fossil fuels that they're extracted are processed, etc., and turned into energy and electricity. But he's, and of course, this is leading conservatives and Republicans and the coal industry in particular to conclude that he is fighting a war against coal. However, the production of oil and gas as well is a place that he could start instead of just going after coal-fired power plants, right? I mean, that's a huge, and taking on some of the biggest companies in the world, ExxonMobil and et cetera, Chevron are the biggest companies in the world. In that sense, is his clean power plan lacking pretty seriously?
Absolutely. And the thing is that, you know, an additional sort of side effect of all of the fracking that's going on in this country is that the price of oil and gas are so low that they, and especially in the case of natural gas, that means that it is providing a sort of an economic disincentive to expand renewable energy. Despite that economic disincentive, solar and wind is taking off. It could be taking off far faster were there a higher carbon fee and dividend or something in place that would actually restrict the rapid pace of expansion of oil and gas production in this country. I have heard our friends at Friends of the Earth, and I haven't had a chance to read the entire power plan, clean power plan from start to finish, but I have heard there are some good things in the power plan, including the possibility of a carbon tax, or as what we're proposing here in Oregon, a fee and dividend. There are also, I'm hearing from my friends at Nuclear Information and Resource Service that there are some good restrictions on nuclear power, which of course is a very costly option that in the aftermath of Fukushima should not be considered a realistic energy strategy for us to pursue. But so there are some good bits and pieces in here, but clearly what we need is a World War II type mobilization. That's where we are historically around clean energy. We need to ramp down our investment, our greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2050. None of this 2005 baseline. We need to be in sync with what the climate science requires. Nothing short of that will allow us to escape what could be irreversible and runaway climate change.
Finally, Daphne, how important is the activism, on-the-ground activism, such as what we saw last week in Portland? People risked their lives. It really takes a great amount of personal risk to do what folks did.
You know, it's funny that I'm glad you brought that up, because there was an op-ed in the LA Times that quoted me recently saying it's not up to us to make that the author of the op-ed said it's not up to local activists like myself to make national policy on fossil fuel exports. Well, you know, we are living in a time when the fossil fuel industry has our politicians you know, operating like little marionettes. So the only option at this point is blockades, and that's why they call it Blockadia. There's a slogan up here in the Northwest. We say coal, oil, gas, none shall pass. And the reason for that being there are 28 proposals that are on the books that, should they succeed, would result in the carbon content of 5 Keystone XL pipelines, which we know Dr. James Hansen says is game over for the planet. So multiply that by 5, and you see what we're up against, and you see why people are simply just saying, we're going to blockade things.
Well, Daphne, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some of these thoughts with us. Thank you. Best of luck to you.
Thank you so much.
My guest is Daphne Wysham. She is the director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for Sustainable Economy. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The life of political prisoner and award-winning journalist Mumia Abu Jamal remains in danger as prison authorities in Pennsylvania are slow to provide him with appropriate medical treatment. Earlier this month, Abu Jamal's blood sugar had reached very dangerously high levels, indicating a diabetic condition that seemingly appeared out of nowhere, and his skin showed evidence of a serious condition as well. Relatives and supporters who managed to visit him in prison in late April reported that he was very weak and barely able to walk and talk. Despite his medical condition having stabilized, concerns remain about testing delays and inadequate medical care. The vibrant reporter, who's been behind bars for more than 30 years and who just celebrated his 61st birthday in prison, has shone a light on prison conditions through his insightful commentaries. But more often than not, his journalistic work focuses on the social and political issues of the day, both national and international. Mumia Abu Jamal has managed to do inside a prison what most people outside have never achieved. He's written more than half a dozen books, starting with his groundbreaking 1996 work, Live from Death Row. Now, City Lights Books has just published his newest work, Writing on the Wall, Selected Prison Writings of Mumia Abu Jamal. The book has a foreword by Dr. Cornel West and has been edited by Dr. Johanna Fernandez, who is a professor of history at Baruch College of the City University of New York, a former Fulbright scholar, and she's one of the coordinators of the campaign to bring Mumia home. I spoke with her recently about the book. Now, in the foreword to the book that you edited, Dr. Cornel West calls Abu Jamal a, quote, black prophetic voice. What does he mean by that, as far as you know?
Well, part of what Cornel West means is that if you look at the history of the United States, there are voices that have historically been uncompromising in speaking truth to power. Those voices have emerged out of the Black experience because the Black experience, the institution of slavery and racism really speak to the contradictions in American society, its promise of democracy and the reality of injustice, slavery, and racism. And these voices include Frederick Douglass, Mumia Abu Jamal, Angela Davis, Dr. Martin Luther King, and many others. They are voices that are radical, uncompromising, and aspire to address the radical, the roots of Black oppression.
Now, last year, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a law after Mumia recorded a commencement address for Goddard College. And the law is called the Re-Victimization Relief Act, which claims that victims of violence are re-victimized when the alleged perpetrators of that violence, who are convicted and imprisoned, speak out from behind bars. Mumia challenged this law in court, and just days ago, a federal judge struck it down. How important is this victory, not just for Mumia, but prisoners everywhere?
This is a tremendously important victory. The judge who declared the law unconstitutional said that the law was manifestly unconstitutional, that free speech must be practiced in this country, even when it comes to prisoners. Now, the reason why this is important is because there is an emerging movement in this country against mass incarceration. Without the voices of prisoners articulating how their cases were mangled in the courts, without these prisoners talking about solitary confinement and the horror that is imprisonment in the United States, the movement against mass incarceration wouldn't be where it is today. So this law was an attack not just on Mumia and his right to speak, but on the rights of all people, and prisoners in particular, who are especially vulnerable because they are behind the wall, and it's very difficult for American citizens to get a sense of what's happening in that sphere of life.
Right, and this isn't the first time that Mumia has legally challenged these sorts of laws that are trying to snuff out the voices. How have other prisoners in general also been encouraged to speak out by the work that Mumia has done? He's recorded thousands of commentaries over the years, and the group that works with him, Prison Radio, now features dozens of prisoners who are also speaking out.
Well, I think that one of the examples that has inspired other prisoners to speak out was Life from Death Row, Mumia's bestseller written in the 1990s, mm-hmm. which humanized death row from the inside. We live in a society that dehumanizes prisoners. And for prisoners to see their stories told from a humanistic perspective inspired them to speak out. So Mumia has become known, as you know, as the voice of the voiceless. And what was encouraging about this latest battle was that the ACLU joined the suit and recruited quite a number of Pennsylvania prisoners whose writings would have been shut down had this law prevailed.
Let's talk about the book coming out soon, a gathering of many of Mumia's short essays over the years. You write in the introduction that initially in his prison journalism career, Mumia spoke about his case a lot. Of course, that's quite natural. But then he sort of transitioned to begin speaking out about other issues and analyzing both foreign and domestic policy issues, and his own case less and less. Can you talk about that sort of evolution in his work?
Right. So this volume is important because it has within it important and rare writings that were produced early on during Mumia's imprisonment, as early as 1982, in which he unequivocally declares his innocence. Mumia was embattled in the courts. He faced a trial that attempted to demonize him. The Fraternal Order of Police has held a long-standing 33-year campaign of demonization and criminalization. And at some point, Mumia, looking at the crisis of incarceration around him as it was growing before his eyes, because he was imprisoned during the period of massive growth in this industry, he turns his gaze away from himself and to the crisis he sees before him. But also, very importantly, he begins to write about and offer a Black radical counter-narrative to the ideology of the ruling class that presided over attacks on the gains of the civil rights movement, the political empowerment over the last 40 years of the 1%, and the deployment of terrorist wars abroad. So this volume really offers a new generation of Black radicals and activists across the country who are being galvanized by the crisis in Ferguson, in Baltimore, but also the transfer of wealth from the bottom of society to the top, the kind of activism that we saw during the Occupy movement. This book offers that generation of activists a way of contextualizing the crisis we're in today and how we got here.
Right, and that's a really important point. How well does Mumia Abu Jamal's case, the persecution that he faced, the reactions that have come from the Fraternal Order of Police, his imprisonment, etc., fit within today's framework of oppression described by the increasingly popular catchphrase that Black Lives Matter? His case began in the 1980s.
Right. So all of the violations in Mumia's case, discrimination in jury selection, blatant racism on the part of the judge who presided over the case, Judge
And even police brutality, right? He was beaten badly during the time of his arrest.
Absolutely. The fact that the police tampered with evidence to obtain a conviction and that he was beaten within an inch of his life on the night that Officer Faulkner was killed and was hospitalized for weeks as a result of this beating. This is the same crisis of police malfeasance that we see over and over and over again, and that intensifies over the last 40 years with the militarization of the police. And the Fraternal Order of the Police, which is the institution that has tried to get him killed, is the same institution, the Fraternal Order of Police, that is trying to influence what's going on in Baltimore today.
Right. Now, let's talk about the fact that Mumia's commentaries on social and political issues here in the U.S. have had a very long trajectory, simply because he's been imprisoned for so long. In the essays collected in the book, he not only critiques Ronald Reagan's economic policies, he covers the Rodney King beating and the trial of the LAPD officers, and Clinton's tough on crime policies and so much more. In his writings, do we see clearly see the way in which specific U.S. policies over the last several decades have taken us to the place we are today?
Absolutely. One of the things that Mumia analyzes, which is important for us today, is the manner in which Black elected officials have been assigned to preside over an urban crisis of epic proportion that has created mass unemployment of African Americans, but also Latinos, and that has therefore required a police force to enforce social control and to warehouse a population that is redundant. So he is one of the social critics who, as early as the 1980s, is looking at the role of Black officials and the manner in which Black elected officials, like Obama, have successfully derailed movements from below. And what he argues is that change in society can only come about when people engage in uprisings as the ones we've seen in Ferguson and Baltimore. But part of what he argues throughout this volume is that organization and a deep understanding of society, its problems and its root causes, is critical to a strategic deployment of our political power from the grassroots.
Now, Dr. Johanna Fernandez, the 30th anniversary of the Philadelphia bombing of the Move House, this organization founded by John Africa, is coming up next week. And we often hear Mumia ending his commentary saying, "Long live John Africa." He writes about John Africa in the book. First, tell us who John Africa was, and then also how serious and undercovered an issue was the government bombing of the Move House in Philadelphia, where 11 people, including 5 children, were essentially killed by the government.
Well, John Africa was the leader of the MOVE organization, an organization that emerges in Philadelphia in the 1970s, just as the civil rights and Black Power movements are declining. This organization is kind of a back to nature organization. It's urban, it's Black. And it is determined to challenge the aggression of the police that is building up in Philadelphia, but across the country in the aftermath of the Black Power movement. The MOVE organization is hated by the establishment in Philadelphia because it is unrelenting in its critique, it's militant. And Mumia Abu Jamal is one of the few journalists in Philadelphia who want to tell the story of MOVE from the perspective of its members. They too have been demonized and criminalized by the Philadelphia mayor, by the police, and by the establishment in its totality. And on May 13th, 1985, there's a battle between the police and the MOVE organization. The police wants the MOVE organization to relinquish its home in Philadelphia. The MOVE organization decides that it has the right to remain where it is. And the police, alongside of the fire department and the black mayor, drop a military-grade bomb on the MOVE house that burns an entire African-American neighborhood. Over 61 homes are burned down to the ground. And this is, you know, an urban holocaust of epic proportion that is understudied, that few Americans know about. And Mumia writes about this urban holocaust in one of his essays that is published here in this book. And he says that the Middle East has its Sabra and its Shatila, and Philadelphia has the MOVE bombing. He writes eloquently about the tragedy of this moment, but what it means about the growing violence of state power in the post-civil rights and Black movement eras.
No, I'm so glad you brought up the comparison that you did, because one of the things that has been so spectacular and important about his commentaries, and one of the many reasons why our program has aired his commentaries, is his foreign policy analysis and its connection to domestic policy. Among the essays that he has in this book that he has just published or is about to publish are comparisons between the conduct of the Iraq War by the United States and similarity of treatment of Iraqi prisoners in Abu Ghraib with prisoners here in the United States. And that's an analysis that we don't see often enough.
Absolutely. Part of what he argues is that the horror that we saw at Abu Ghraib would not have been possible had that kind of dehumanization and systematic abuse of human rights not been practiced on American soil against American prisoners, a disproportionate number of whom are African American and Latino. So part of what he says is that the guards and soldiers who deployed terror against Iraqis at Abu Ghraib were previously employed in prisons in the United States. And part of what he argues, I think brilliantly, is that the kind of occupations we see in Palestine are the same occupations we see in neighborhoods like Baltimore. And without understanding that systematic deployment of state violence by the police and by an increasingly militarized police force, we don't understand the ferocity of Baltimore and the rebellion from below. And as we've seen, images of young people throwing rocks at police in Baltimore were comparable to young Palestinians throwing rocks at the Israeli military during the Intifada.
And of course, similar demonization of both groups of young people in the media. You point out in your introduction, finally, that although the state has relentlessly persecuted Mumia for over 33 years, painting him as a hardened and hateful killer, his voice is without bitterness. And you're right, I've noticed that too. And why do you think that is?
You know, it's one of the conundrums, because if you study Mumia's case and you study the manner in which the Fraternal Order of Police has relentlessly demonized him and influenced the the court process in his case and the appellate process, you scratch your head and ask, how is this man able to retain his humanity and the sense of profound love that pulses through his commentaries? And part of what Mumia says is that the incredible amount of support and love he feels daily from letters written to him by his supporters from around the world has sustained him. But I think that his clear analysis of the problems in the United States and the world over, his critique of capitalism and empire have allowed him to sustain a steady voice. And his study of social movements have allowed him to hope, continue to fight for the highest aspirations of society. So I think that's what sustains him.
And finally, how important is it for people to call on the Pennsylvania Corrections Department to demand that he either be given appropriate medical treatment, which it sounds like they might be slowly starting to do now, or to simply demand that he be released in order to get good treatment? How important is it for that continuing call to go out?
Mumia Abu Jamal is dangerously ill. I visited with him this Sunday. And even though he was able to walk, for the first time in a long time, he still remains very weak. He walks very slowly, and he still is in a lot of pain. But most importantly, his skin condition has worsened. And what I noted during the visit is that he did not stop shaking over the course of the 4 hours that I was with him. So Mumia remains dangerously ill, and I personally think that there is an attempt at a public execution of Mumia Abu Jamal on the part of the state. Mumia is a dangerous voice, especially in this moment of upheaval. His voice represents a continuity in struggle from the 1960s and the Black Power movement to today, and the lessons of those struggle. That is very dangerous in this moment when we are seeing such pretty open challenges to the police and state power, as we've seen in Baltimore.
Dr. Johanna Fernandez is a professor of history at Baruch College of the City University of New York. She's a former Fulbright scholar and one of the coordinators of the campaign to bring Mumia home. She is also the editor of the new book by Mumia Abu Jamal entitled Writing on the Wall, Selected Prison Writings of Mumia Abu Jamal. And I had spoken to her recently about the book and also about the medical conditions that Mumia is struggling with. We turn next to Abu Jamal himself, who, while in prison, recorded the following essay from his book Writing on the Wall.
Democracy, Dictatorships, and Empire, December 28, 2003. An essay from the new collection, Writing on the Wall. There is a profound contradiction at the heart of American political life. The claim to be a democracy and the bitter struggle to deny that status to almost anyone else in the world, all in the name of bringing democracy to the world. If there is one constant in American past and present history, it is the determination of the powerful elites in this country to impose their will upon that of other nations, against the wishes of the majority of people in foreign nations. The American empire utilizes force, brutal and terrifying, to intimidate the populations of other nations. And this, when alloyed with the mesmerizing power of the corporate press, serves to whitewash what is actually taking place. When one looks at the present situation in Iraq, where the United States, on behalf of the whole world, we are assured, invades a sovereign nation which has not attacked the U.S., topples its government, bombs cities, and installs a puppet regime, we are assured, once again, that this is done for the Iraqis and not for U.S. corporations. We have been here before, scores of times. In 1915, the United States invaded nearby Haiti, ostensibly to deal with violence on the island. It dealt with it by bringing more. The U.S. Marines forced the Haitian legislature to select the candidate that U.S. invaders wanted as president. When Haiti refused to declare war against Germany, the Americans dissolved the Haitian legislature. The Americans then pushed through a sham referendum for a new Haitian constitution, one far less democratic than the instrument it replaced. As for the so-called referendum, under U.S. bayonets, it passed by a ridiculous 98,225 to 768. When Haitian nationalists rose up to oppose the northern invader some years later, the United States let loose a bloodbath, killing some 3,000 Haitians in the infamous Cacos Rebellion. George Burnett, a U.S. Marine general, would complain, practically indiscriminate killing of natives has gone on for some time. Barnett found this violent episode startling. American troops put these proud people, who had forced two European powers, France and England, to surrender, in shackles on road crews and dismantled Haitian homesteads to make room for large plantations. As Piero Glahesis observed, it is not that President Wilson failed in his earnest efforts to bring democracy to these little countries. He never tried. He intervened to impose hegemony, not democracy. Indeed, this is not a Haitian tale alone, for the U.S. invaded Cuba 4 times, Nicaragua 5 times, Honduras 7 times, the Dominican Republic 4 times, Haiti twice, Guatemala once, Panama twice, Mexico 3 times, and Colombia 4 times in the 36 years from 1898 to 1934 alone. It went not to plant democracies, like they're some kind of tobacco plant, but to remove democracies, to prop up dictators, and to support repression. Iraq is an inheritor to a grim and dark history that began in the Americas, spanned the Caribbean, and touched the region before. It brought the ignominious reign of the Shah to the peacock throne of Iran, tossing out a democratically elected president, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh's great offense? He dared to nationalize the vast oil resources of Iran. For this affront to the American oil merchants, the United States imposed the brutal and repressive dictatorship of the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, who turned the nation into a private fiefdom and a torture chamber. Indeed, it was hatred of the Shah that launched the Iranian Revolution and put the Ayatollah Khomeini in power there. Similar forces are mobilizing in the Persian Gulf today to wipe out the Western-backed dictatorships that sit above unhappy, unstable quasi-states. Americans, if they have any inkling of history, can no longer claim ignorance when it happens again. You've been listening to an essay from the new book, Writing on the Wall. This is its author, Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
And that does it with our program today. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director, and Kiana Turner is our production coordinator. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Golhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.